The article of the week is Imagine This Was Your School. One thing I want you guys to notice is that this is a paired text. That means that we're going to look at two different types of text that share a common theme or topic. Um, our theme or topic, obviously, we've been talking about equality, justice, injustice, segregation, discrimination, integration, all those words. So you're going to notice that as a theme and as a topic in the paired text for the article of the week. The first text is nonfiction, and the second one will be a poem. Okay, and again, they both share the same theme. So the article this week is called Imagine This Was Your School. In 1951, there were 21 states that forced black students and white students to go to separate schools. These schools were supposed to be separate but equal, but they never were. Where white schools tended to be modern and comfortable, black schools like this one were old and dilapidated. This 16-year-old had had enough, and in an act of tremendous bravery, she decided to do something about it. What followed changed America forever. Behind a purple and gold curtain on the stage of her school's auditorium, Barbara Johns, 16, stood waiting. What she was about to do could put her and her friends and family in danger. But she felt no fear. The curtain rose. A gasp rippled across the room as hundreds of students looked up at her, surprised and amazed. What Barbara was about to say would change their lives forever. Now, that little introduction piece right there sort of foreshadows or gives us some clues about something that's going to happen later in this article. All right? Now they're going to give us some background information. Now you're going to notice throughout the article there are pictures with captions. Make sure you read those captions. I've already numbered the paragraphs for you, all right? And there are some things that you're going to need to do throughout the article after you listen to it and reread it. So make sure you follow those directions. Things like picking out captions, subheadings, changing the subheadings into questions and things like that. Okay? So our first subheading is separate but not equal. It was 1951 in the rural community of Farmville, Virginia. For Black Americans, it was a difficult time, not only in Farmville, but across the U.S. A racist policy called segregation had created deep inequality. Under segregation, Black Americans and white Americans were kept separate. Blacks could not ride in the same rail cars as whites. Black people were forced to sit at the back of buses, while white people sat at the front. There were separate drinking fountains, and some restaurants would not even allow black people to come inside. Schools throughout the South and elsewhere were racially segregated as well. In Virginia, a law actually forbade black students and white students from going to school together. Supposedly, these schools were separate but equal, but in reality, there was profound disparity between them. Take, for instance, the schools in Farmville. Barbara's school, the all-black Robert Russa Mouton High School, was in disrepair. The toilets were old and cracked, the stall doors were rickety, and others wouldn't close. The classroom ceilings were so leaky that students sat at their desks with umbrellas to keep water from making the leak on their papers run. In the winter, students sitting near the wood-burning stoves overheated, while those far from the stoves were so cold they shivered in their coats and hats. Smoke from the stoves eddied into the classroom, causing sneezing and watery eyes. Kids got sick often. The school was also wildly overcrowded. Mouton High had been designed for 180 students, yet 450 were enrolled. To create more space, shacks with wood frames and tar-coated paper walls were built. Students called these makeshift classrooms chicken coops because that's what they look like. Some classes were held in a dilapidated bus in the parking lot. Meanwhile, across town, white kids attended Farmville High, which had a real cafeteria, a fully equipped auditorium, spacious classrooms, locker rooms, and modern heating. When Mooten parents and teachers complained to the school board, they were told a new school would be built soon. It was clear, though, that soon would probably never come. Most funds were going to the white students. The only things going to Mooten were Farmville's old textbooks. What could Barbara do? Barbara lived on a small tobacco farm. She had a reputation as an introspective and hard-working girl. She took care of her younger sister and two younger brothers and did chores, working in the fields and feeding the animals. She enjoyed solitude and could often be found in the woods behind her house. She didn't have a lot of put-on airs about her, her grandmother said proudly. She was a country girl. But as her classmates would soon learn, there was a lot more to Barbara Johns than met the eye. Underneath her reserved demeanor was enormous courage and growing outrage. She loved learning, and she loved her teachers. She longed to have the school that she and her classmates deserved. But in the 1950s, challenging whites was dangerous. Black people were treated with contempt and bigotry. In the South, a terrible practice known as lynching, in which a mob of white people would kill a black person for some supposed offense without a trial or any kind of legal proceeding, was common. Because judges, juries, and police officers were all white, these killings usually went unpunished. Yet Barbara was not afraid. She believed that it was up to her to do something. But what? A bold plan. Now, I want you to remember they just described Barbara and her personality. She was very introspective. She wasn't really outgoing. She was an outdoor kind of person, and she was kind of quiet. She liked the solitude. So a bold plan. This is going to be interesting for her, having that kind of personality and kind of stepping out there and speaking out. One night, after Barbara said her prayers, an idea came to her: a strike. If she and her classmates refused to go to school, the school board would have to do something, wouldn't they? And surely nobody would harm children peacefully protesting the substandard conditions of their school, right? The very next day, Barbara convinced a handful of her classmates to put aside their fears and join her strike. But they had to keep their plan top secret. If their parents or teachers knew what they were up to, they would forbid the strike. Plus, Barbara wanted to make sure that the teachers could not be accused of permitting the strike. If people thought the teachers knew about it beforehand, they could lose their jobs. On April 23, 1951, the day of the strike, a student called the principal from a payphone. Disguising his voice, he said some Mooten students were loitering downtown and in trouble with the police. Loitering means hanging around. The principal reacted predictably. Black students in trouble with the all-white police was a serious matter. He hurried to his car and sped from the school. The moment he was gone, students delivered notes to each classroom calling an assembly. Barbara had written the notes and signed them B.J., which was how Principal Boyd Jones usually signed notes. Barbara shared those same initials. When the curtain rose to reveal Barbara instead of the principal on stage, everyone was shocked. Then she began to speak. She talked about the inferior conditions of their school. She talked about the fact that the school board had denied them proper funding. She talked about how hard it was to learn in this environment. Are we just going to accept these conditions, she asked, or are we going to do something about it? By the time her stirring speech was over, many students were on Barbara's side. The entire school body walked out in peaceful protest. The fight was just beginning. The local newspaper ridiculed the students, accusing them of looking for an excuse to skip classes and play. The superintendent threatened to fire teachers and the principal for not maintaining order. The strike, it appeared, was a failure, yet the students held firm and refused to attend class until they were given a new school. Barbara called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, an organization working for equality for blacks. She persuaded two NAACP lawyers to come to Farmville. Lawyers said they would back the students if they were willing to demand integration, that is, black students and white students attending school together, and if their parents were behind them. To Barbara, demanding integration seemed like reaching for the moon. At a town meeting attended by almost the entire black community of Farmville, Barbara gave another, even more rousing speech. The crowd erupted in joyous singing and teary eyes. After much discussion and more speeches, the entire community agreed to get behind a lawsuit demanding integration. But the fight was just beginning. After the lawsuit was filed, Barbara received a death threat. Fearing for Barbara's safety, her parents sent her to live with her uncle in Alabama. She finished high school far from her friends. A landmark decision. Landmark meaning really big and very powerful. What happened next exceeded all of Barbara's expectations. The lawsuit went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where it was bundled with similar lawsuits from Kansas, Delaware, Washington, D.C., and South Carolina. Named for a plaintiff from Kansas, the case was called Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education, declaring segregated schools illegal. Barbara was by then a student at Spelman College in Georgia. She was so excited by the decision that she shouted with happiness. Across the U.S., many reacted with anger to the Supreme Court's decision. Barbara's family's home was burned to the ground in what was most likely a case of arson. Her parents were unable to rebuild their home or keep their farm going because none of the banks or stores in town would give them credit. So Barbara's parents and her younger siblings left the place their family had called home for generations and moved to Washington, D.C. An act of courage. Barbara's act of courage helped fuel a movement that would change everything. In Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, Rosa Parks captured the nation's attention when she refused to move to the back of the bus. The bus boycott that followed led to the desegregation of city buses. Martin Luther King Jr. embraced nonviolent protests like Barbara's as the most effective means of achieving racial equality. Peaceful marches, sit-ins, and boycotts became the hallmark of civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. Barbara lived to see all of this unfold, but she never made any more speeches or sought recognition for what she did as a teenager. She married, earned her degree, raised a family in Philadelphia, and became a school librarian. She died in 1991. Today, Barbara's story is not widely told, but if you wander onto the Capitol grounds in Richmond, Virginia, you will find a statue honoring the courage of Barbara and the Mouton students. Engraved on the statue are Barbara's words, "It seemed like reaching for the moon." So those words were used when a poem was written about what Barbara did. And the poem is just above there. It says, "Barbara Johns Reaches for the Moon" by Irene Latham. Now this is the poem that I want you all to read aloud, and I want you to record yourself using Photo Booth, okay, or QuickTime, or you can use the Canvas option as well. Now, what I want you to do when you read the poem, you need to read it with feeling. Make sure you pronounce the words correctly. So you may want to practice it a few times before you record yourself. I'm going to go ahead and read it for you first. Barbara Johns Reaches for the Moon by Irene Latham. She steps onto the stage, makes a bold declaration. No, now, strike. Without hesitation, she illuminates the situation. Separate but not equal. Cracked toilets, smoke inhalation, tar paper shacks packed with the student population. Despite danger, despite trepidation, she clings to the dream with determination, joins the fight for integration. Together they march, like constellations across a midnight sky. Their combined shine, inspiration for a changing nation. When we look back at that poem, there's a few things I want you guys to notice. If you look at the way the poet has written the words no, now, strike, that's for effect because as Barbara was stepping onto that stage, okay, she was about to make a very bold statement or declaration, and that took a lot of courage for her to do that, all right, to talk about the situation. I also want you to notice they really describe using some great imagery words here. smoke inhalation, cracked toilets, tar paper shacks. All right. The other thing is together they march like constellations across the midnight sky. Remember, that's a simile. We're comparing the march to constellations across the midnight sky using the word like. All right. Now, when you record yourself, don't forget, you may need to do it a few times and then go ahead and submit the one that you think is the best.